dirty moderates, I know those of you who are devoted listeners often will ask me, why are you a moderate? How did you become a moderate? How do you define a moderate? And of course, many of my friends way on the left think I'm just a fuzzy, abstract person who can't commit, who probably is just a lapsed Democrat and doesn't know where to go. Other people see me on the right as a very left-wing person because of my social positions, which is to say that I think I'm doing something right because I resist categorization and elude labels and remain moderate. And today we're very fortunate to have a guest on who I think can provide not just an explanation of moderation, but it provides the intellectual firmament for what we do here. And so I am pleased to welcome Professor Aurelian Craiutu. He is a professor of political science at Indiana University. He's a professor, also specialist in French political thought. He wrote on many issues, right on Tocqueville. He had a book a few years back called Faces of Moderation, The Art of Balance in the Age of Extremes. But he has a new book coming out, and we've got a little sneak peek at it. It doesn't come out till August, but it's called Why Not Moderation? Letters to Young Radicals. And boy, do those young radicals need letters. Aurelian, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Okay. So I just want to let's go back to the beginning because I think your book does that so well. And if somebody were to create a primer, let's say, which I think you're doing very well in this new book, on moderation, on what it means to be moderate, what do moderates adhere to? How would you, in the broadest sense, begin to define it?
Well, this takes a full book to answer your question, of course,
Yes.
and perhaps more than one. But in a nutshell, I would start by saying that when we speak about moderation, we need to be aware, first and foremost, of the tradition of moderation. There is a tradition behind this concept. It's not something that is invented to support a political position that happens to be ours or of our opponents. There is a significant tradition of moderation that goes back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Aristotle is there, but also Plato, if you want, Thucydides as well, and comes all the way through the modern age, let's say in the works of Montaigne, for example, or Montesquieu, Federalist Papers, to our present era. And that tradition is complex. In my work, and I've devoted to this topic a few books by now, I always emphasize the existence of an archipelago of moderation, which means islands, intellectual islands, so to speak, of moderation that are connected to each other, but they are independent at the same time. So it's important, first and foremost, to be aware of the tradition. It's an old virtue which is present today as well. Secondly, there are lots of misunderstandings surrounding moderation, and I think that they need to be addressed before we explain what moderation is. And there's a host of, let's say, misrepresentation of moderation that we can talk about, starting with identifying moderation with a lukewarm centrism, like a wishy-washy, neither here nor there position, and ending with the characterization of moderation as a virtue for weak minds, people who cannot make firm decisions. So those are misrepresentations that need to be addressed. And lastly, I think we need to talk about the political vision behind moderation, and that requires a substantive conversation. What do moderates believe in? And here we have a range of issues from, let's say, related topics such as compromise, centrism, pluralism, and dialogue to others such as the virtues undergirding a moderate stance, such as humility, civility, and prudence. So what I want to suggest here by giving you this answer is that you cannot and we cannot study moderation in the abstract. You need the history of moderation. You need to see how moderation is instantiated in historical context and in individual characters. So studying moderation by looking at moderates it's a very good way to proceed. But also we need to look at related concepts. So moderation in the abstract makes no sense, but you need to look at the synonyms of moderation. I've mentioned a few: prudence, civility, dialogue, centrism. pluralism, and also the opposites of moderation. So, what does it mean to be an immoderate figure, such as fanaticism, extremism, and radicalism? So, I want to make this a complex subject rather than simplify it and presented it in one face. There are phases of moderation, and those phases are ethical, constitutional, and institutional, and there is, let's say, a style of moderation that can be identified. So this is a complex virtue with a long tradition, situated in the, let's say, middle of a field, semantic field that contains both synonyms and antonyms.
Wow, thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, I was once having a casual conversation with a group of friends, mainly on the left, actually, and they weren't so much before the podcast. They weren't so much criticizing moderation as they were dreaming of revolution, and like they were in some Russian salon in the late 19th century or something, and talking about the zeal and the passion that's missing from our politics whatsoever, what have you. And I said, guys, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And they said, what do you mean? I said, one of the great, I think, failures of radicalism, and we're just talking about something antithetical to moderation, obviously, is that it fails to account fundamentally for human nature. You can spend days reading Karl Marx, days and days and days and days, which I have back in my university days, and marvel at the brilliance of a theory that in practice fails to take into account that one central idea, the idea that there is some utopia waiting to be discovered, that humans can be somehow perfect, not just good. What do you think? And you write about liberal democracy, which is our biggest concern here at the show. What do you think about the fact that in America we're so hyper polarized, and that we have obviously the right, which I think is a great danger to democracy, of course, MAGA and Trumpism, as I call it. And then on the left, which is the sort of first thing I want to tackle, going to the idea of identity politics, troubling the idea of classical liberalism, and, feeling that American institutions and values, Enlightenment values, are kind of now rotten, sort of have run the course, and we need to do something else. How do I answer these people beyond what I've said? I think, meaning you've given a great firmament for that, a great outlook. Do you want to take a shot at that?
Let's try to answer this. So first, I'd like to refer to what you said at the beginning of your remarks, which is uh, there is something in moderation that opposes utopianism.
Okay.
There is something in moderation that encourages us to be pragmatic,
Right.
realists, starting with the world as is, nor as it should be. Of course, it doesn't mean that there are no ideals, but you are not willing to sacrifice generations of individuals for the sake of a future radiant that may never come. There's the famous metaphor of breaking the eggs to create a great omelet. How many eggs you can be allowed to break until you come up with a great omelet? And for that matter, I think the emphasis on individual dignity is very important. We cannot sacrifice the happiness of the present generation for the sake of an imaginary future. But your second part of your remarks deals with polarization in today's America, and um, there are different types of polarization. There's an ideological polarization. People support different positions on the left and the right or the center. And there's an affective polarization, which refers to the fact that you hate the other side so much that you are prepared to go to the extreme to make it, to make your position stronger and to annihilate your opponent. Now, what can moderation do in this case? Well, there are a number of things that moderation teaches us, looking at the historical cases. First of all, there is a politics of skepticism that is related to moderation. What do I mean by that? The idea that I think there are corners of life that we cannot touch, that we should left unaddressed maybe, and there is a limit. There are limits to our understanding and to our knowledge that we should all be aware of, and we should honor in other ways. moderation can help us be less self-righteous, um, be prepared to accept that others may have better answers than us. And moderation, because it starts from the world as is an invitation to stick to the facts rather than to alternative facts. So this is a modest beginning,
Hmm.
but if you stick to the facts rather than imagine things as you would like them to be, if you are prepared to engage in a conversation with those who disagree with you, with the expectation that in the dialogue you may come to learn better the grounds of your own position,
Hmm.
but also you may be proven wrong. So you may learn something new about the world through the eyes of your opponents. I think that that is a good step forward, and moderation can help us. So in my new book, Why Not Moderation, I devote a chapter to modesty and humility. And
Hmm.
I think that those are two virtues in short supply in today's world. Why so? Well, because we are all self-righteous. We all enter the public and private conversations with the knowledge of the final answer. Or a good dialogue starts from the assumption of one's fallibility. We do
Hmm.
not know the answers. We are searching in common. And that spirit of humility, I think, when it informs our political and public deliberations, can carry us pretty far because we do not seek to teach others, but we seek to learn from others. So moderation can help, but it's not a recipe. It's not a panacea.
Hmm.
There are moments when you cannot be a moderate.
Right.
Okay, January 6, 2021.
Right.
That's a red line. A red line
Yep.
has been crossed. You can't say,
Yep.
well, on the one hand there were people who are demonstrating peacefully. On the other hand, no. That that's not going to work. So there are moments in history where you have to draw the line and say, okay, enough is enough, and I can do no other. I can espouse no other position. But those moments are fortunately rare in history, and I think moderation can help us deal even with our current level of toxic polarization that we're witnessing in our country.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I always say here at the pot, or one of our taglines, is we're saving democracy one episode at a time. But the other thing I say, especially to people I bring on for, bring on to sort of, I guess, for lack of a better word, debate with, is democracy, in my view, depends upon our disagreement. It's disagreeing in a democracy isn't a marginal or a nominal idea. And I also think that disagreement, I obviously don't mean vengeful disagreement and raw ideological disagreement, but I mean all of us in sort of a town square writ large to be able to have a conversation, oppose each other in our viewpoints, and meet somewhere in the middle. And that is harder and harder to do in this climate, wouldn't you say?
It's very difficult, and it starts with all of us. I want to emphasize that it starts with us, the teachers in college. It so happens that I've just finished teaching a class on this very topic. I teach a
Okay.
course on polarization, and we
Okay.
read today an excellent text by Bret Stephens, published in the New York Times a few years ago, The Art of Civil Disagreement.
Hmm.
In this piece, which I like very much, Stevens makes a very simple and a very important point. To disagree well, you need to understand well first.
Right.
Understanding well requires certain things, among them, listening, never starting a conversation with a presumption of self righteousness.
Mm-hmm.
Always start from the assumption that you know the grounds of your beliefs, but you may be proven to be wrong, and you may learn something new in the process. Now, if we approach public debates with that in mind, I think that the acrimonious style that we are witnessing today will not be as intense as it is now. So I think that the art of disagreement is an art that must be taught and must be learned. And we college teachers in this case, but everyone else at the lower levels as well, like it should start in primary schools. We need to learn the art of disagreement. Now, disagreeing with someone else is sometimes not comfortable.
Hmm.
We all want to be agreed with. We want to agree with others, and we want to be confirmed in our beliefs. And this discomfort is something that we've lost, in the sense that now we either jump to cancel a speaker that we find disagreeable or we dislike his or her ideas, or we just simply shut down and we don't want to engage in any conversation. That temptation must be resisted. I'm not talking here about the left or the right, because this temptation can be found on both sides of the political spectrum. So it's not a critique of the woke culture of the left, as it's sometimes implied. The cancel culture exists on the right as well. I'm interested in what can we do across the board to fight that temptation to cancel, to silence, to disagree poorly. So there is a good disagreement and bad disagreement. And to disagree well, you need to understand well, and understanding requires effort. And we don't do that effort all the time. We use shortcuts, intellectual shortcuts. You are on the left, I'm on the right, you are on the what kind of political spectrum, I don't know. I put you in a box, and immediately the conversation ends because I know exactly what you'll be arguing for. That is a temptation that I think moderates resist, and I write about it in my new book.
Yeah, I mean, I think another way of looking at it too, or saying that, is that I think that ideology, right, and having a set of beliefs from which you never swerve, is comforting. And not to me, weirdly, and I guess I'm an outlier, but to people who really believe their way is the only way. And I would say that's the majority of people I know. And a corollary to the idea of democracy being a disagreement, and relying on disagreement, rather. And I say it also on the show. What if I'm wrong? I
It's a
mean,
it's a good question to ask. What
I
if I'm
mean,
wrong?
with humility being inherent to moderation, I can have somebody on, and I could be championing affirmative action. I'm just picking something. I'm not saying I did this. And, really believing that systemic racism requires XYZ, and find out that, well, I'm wrong. Maybe it does violate the Civil Rights Act. Maybe it doesn't accomplish what it's supposed to. Maybe it has run out of gas. All of those things are part of the conversation. So I always question myself, hence the creation of this podcast.
I think foray like this are essential for promoting precisely the spirit of civil disagreement. Now,
Okay.
I want to go back a little bit to the point that you made earlier,
Okay.
which has to do with what if I'm wrong? Well, there's nothing wrong with admitting that one is wrong,
Right.
and as a matter of fact, there's an old joke about a rabbi in Galicia who once said, "If I hear that someone is 50% right, I say that's good, keep on doing the good work. If I hear that someone is 60 claims to be 65% of the time right, I tend to become a little suspicious. I said, okay, that's a gift of God. Let him continue along the same path. If I hear that someone is 90% wrong, then I'm very suspicious. I become nervous. And if I hear someone claiming to be 100% wrong, then that's a fanatic and extremist, and it must be fought against. So it's good to be wrong. It's good to admit that facts change, and facts do change. As a matter of fact, there's
Yeah.
something about being consistent in one's inconsistency. You don't have to think according to the book, and that's the distinction that you drew at the beginning between ideology and moderation. In my book, I identify two ways of thinking about this. One is thinking ideologically. You put
Mhm.
your ideological blinders. You call yourself a man or a woman of the left or the right, and you
Mhm.
judge accordingly every single position, from affirmative action to same-sex marriage or anything else, religion, through the lenses of your ideology. And the opposite of that is thinking politically, which means that you look at the context, you try to do your homework, you try to get the facts right. And thinking politically requires that sometimes you shift your position and espouse positions that you either previously did not uphold, or you opposed. And there's nothing wrong with that, as long as you've done your homework, as long as you've uh, processed through your own mind um, those issues. Relying on a book, that's okay up to a point, but it's not going to take you far, because the world is changing constantly. And again, there are many ways of adjusting to the world. You don't have to remain on the same position.
Since I was about 16, I guess, I'm thinking back to my American Lit days, my favorite quote I mean, literally, my favorite quote, which I come back to all the time, actually haven't used on the show very much, is the Emerson quote. A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, philosopher, statesmen, and divines. And I always come back to that because I think it I mean, quite frankly, in some, and I guess I can't, doesn't categorize me completely, but it does very much reflect my way of thinking. And I think that's very applicable to your work, wouldn't you say?
I would say so. And if you allow me, I would like to reply by offering another quote from a different thinker, one of my
Okay.
favorites. One I like Emerson a lot.
Okay.
This is the Spanish philosopher Jose Ortega y Gasset, who wrote this, and this may be triggering some of those who are listening to us, but
Okay.
so be it. Aligning oneself with the left as with the right, Ortega said, is only one of the numberless ways open to man of being an imbecile. Both are forms of moral hemiplegia, which is a stroke. This is harsh, but it conveys something that I think can be said in a milder way, which is we need to be flexible.
Yes, and to your to his point of imbecility, or things that are imbecilic. My other favorite idea. I actually don't remember the exact wording. I'm paraphrasing. Is the Fitzgerald quote, or at least it's allegedly he said this, that the test of a first rate
Yeah,
intellect is being able to hold two contradictory thoughts in your head at once. And I think that makes Ortega's point. I mean,
it
you
makes
know.
it absolutely. And by the way, that comes from an excellent novel called The Crack Up.
Oh, so
Did
it
you know?
actually was. Yeah, I
It's
I,
in a
I
crack up. Yes, yeah.
and as I'm an Americanist through and through, I haven't read that Fitzgerald, and I always thought that was, one of those quotes that was just sort of hovering out there or misattributed, as so many quotes are.
It's correct, and you'll find it in the crack up.
Ah, good to hear. Now, Aurelian, what I want to also talk about is, of course, you and your background, because I think it's very essential to your thinking and what you experienced, what you saw. To give the listeners a little biography, where are you from, and what were your formative years like?
I guess my interest in political moderation stems from my education and my upbringing. I grew up in communist Romania, and I think that was a great advantage for me because I was immunized against the temptation of, let's say, extreme radicalism very early on because I lived under a regime that was practicing a radical government. So I grew up and I did my undergraduate studies in Bucharest, and then I kind of veered away from my studies. I was trained as an economist, believe it or not, but I've always felt that my heart was not there. So I discovered my passion for political theory not after, but it was intensified after reading Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. It was a major intellectual encounter
I think it's the
for me.
best book on politics there is, in my opinion.
It's a book that I've been rereading since. I don't take Tocqueville to be the guru that some make him into, but I do think that it's a extremely important book for me. I read it early on. It stimulated my interest, and ever since I've been working on him a little bit and around him because I study French political thought.
Mhm.
So, and then I did my graduate work at Princeton in the mid 90s, where I worked on the French political thought that I mentioned earlier. Incidentally, I worked there under the supervision of one of the great Emerson scholars, George Kateb, who wrote an excellent book
Wow.
on Emerson and self-reliance, which I
Yes.
recommend warmly. And then I went on to teach at Duke University of Northern Iowa prior to joining Indiana University in Bloomington in 2001. So my intellectual trajectory, I think, explains a little bit my passion for moderation, which I think stems from my having witnessed the revolutions of 1981, which were a momentous event in the history of the 20th century. In 1989, communism fell in Eastern Europe. It
Yeah.
fell within a matter of months. There's a joke that is being circulated, or it was at some point, the saying that communism took 10 years to fall in Poland, since the formation of the solidarity. It took 10 months to fall in Hungary, 10 weeks to fall in Czechoslovakia, 10 days to fall in Bulgaria, and 10 hours to fall in Romania. So 10, 10, 10. Unfortunately, my native country, Romania, witnessed a bloody fall of communism. 1,033 people died in December of 1989. So it wasn't a civil, amiable divorce, as it was the case in Poland or Hungary, where communism fell as a result of round tables between the opposition and the communists. In Romania, it was different. So that experience, I think, colored my understanding of politics and gave me an understanding of how important ideas are. Ideas do have consequences. Good ideas have good consequences. Bad ideas have bad consequences.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, in your latest book, pouring it over, and it's a book I'm going to be reading over and over again. You make a wonderful point, which I always, I guess, in my own way, cogitate on and espouse, is liberal democracy. Okay, in its essence, is always evolving. There's no endpoint you discuss. It's not okay, folks, here we are and that's it. It morphs, it changes. It's certainly, as an idea, incredibly discursive intellectually, in terms of how you apply it. I think what I'm curious about is going back to 1991 and 1989 and all that, the famous end of history, the Francis Fukuyama idea, that the Cold War was over and we're now going to go forward, which, again, is the sort of contra to Marx, right? That in
Absolutely.
right. But neither of those things are true. I mean, we're witnessing in our eyes, I don't think an unusual transformation, but I think if you look at history and you dive into a lot of that, the kind of malleability and constant life force that is liberal democracy.
Absolutely. It's an open horizon. By the way, you mentioned the name of Fukuyama. It so happens that he's giving a lecture in this very building where I am at this very moment.
Wow. I
He's our guest. He's our guest this week. He's invited to Bloomington to give two so-called patent lectures, and he has kindly agreed to meet with our students as well.
Oh,
So,
great.
having said that, the liberal democracy that you mentioned is an ongoing project. Now, we should never forget that liberal democracy has triumphed over its enemies in the 20th century. The two major enemies were fascism, Nazism, and communism. Now, liberal democracy may not be perfect. It has certainly its own problems and dark sides, but it has been proven to be stronger than its enemies, which were seen as all powerful at some point. So that's the first lesson of history. Never underestimate the virtues and the resilience of liberal democracy. Number two, I think that it's very important to figure out what we should ask from liberal democracy after we identify what it is and what we should not ask from it. Liberal democracy is a set of institutions and a set of norms that govern our social and political interaction. Those norms include, let's say, political contestation. There's no final truth we seek in common, but also requires the rule of law, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
The rule of law, separation of powers, balance of powers, and so forth. Now, those principles are essential to living in a decent society. Without those principles, you cannot live as a free citizen. Look at what's going on today in Hong Kong.
Hmm.
Hong Kong used to have those principles. It no longer has them. Opposition is virtually impossible. The rule of law has been abolished. And I think that those are the things that liberal democracy can guarantee and will guarantee. Now, does liberal democracy offer an answer to the meaning of life? The question, what is the meaning of life? No, it doesn't. But it allows us, you and me, and many other citizens who live under this regime, to seek for that answer and seek through the lenses of our own reason, okay, in
Mm-hmm.
freedom. So that opportunity is essential. In other words, the market, the free market that is so abhorred on the left and in some forms of the right today, is not supposed to tell us what is the good life, but it's supposed to give us an opportunity to seek for the good life. Now, that distinction is sometimes obliterated in the debates. I have good friends on the right who write about the failure of liberal democracy, as if liberal democracy should give us a sense of what is the final meaning in life. No, it's not. There are, however, certain spheres in life that remain beyond the sphere of politics, beyond the sphere of demand and supply, beyond the sphere of economics. And I think those are extremely important. And I think that we need to recognize what those are, because we don't want to ask um, from politics, from economics, things that they cannot offer. So it's very important to realize what liberal democracy is. It's an instrument. It's not the final response to the question, what is the meaning of life or what is the good life? But it's an opportunity for us to search for it. And I think that the best definition of liberal democracy that I can think of is the one given by Karl Popper, the philosopher Karl Popper, in The Open Society and Its Enemies, a book written in 1945, but whose message has remained as relevant then as it is now. So it's very important to highlight the concept of open society based on contestation, the acceptance of one's imperfect knowledge and fallibility, and small steps forward. This is what he calls not utopian social engineering, but piecemeal social engineering, making small steps forward, reforms, but not revolution.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, in the world of academia, the world of in your career, in the world of intellectuals, certainly my experience does confirm the right's charge, though I think the right is saying it in bad faith, that it's mainly professors are mainly on the left. I mean, not necessarily everybody's not as far left, but they're on the left. I mean, what I mean by that is that most of the courses I took, fundamental to my studies in American studies, were the idea that America is deeply flawed, possibly irredeemable to certain people. This is not my belief, to be clear. This is what I'm amalgamating here a few different courses, but still, systemic racism has always been there. And of course, that liberalism, not so much liberal democracy, but I don't think they know exactly where to put this. But liberalism, what my political mentor would call liberal nationalism, is somehow inhibiting and making a more just world impossible. And I say this both to ask your response to that, but also if students are coming through, let's just call it an immoderate university setting, right? How do we allow them? How do we allow them an opportunity to understand liberal democracy, define it without it being a dogma? I guess is a good way to ask a question.
Well, it's a very complex
Yes,
question, and I will
yes, it
not
was.
be able to render justice to it. I see two
Okay.
parts to it. Let's
Yes.
start with the first one. American Studies program. There's a joke circulating amongst academics that some American Studies programs are better called anti-American Studies programs,
I've never
and
heard that. That's great. Very much so. That's great.
it's the case with some, but not with all of them. Look, we need to start from history again, and I think this answers both sides of your question, Adam, which is America has always been from day one an open experiment.
Yes.
I have a
An
chapter,
idea, right?
an
An idea.
idea, and
Yeah.
that's why it's unique, because others are based on race, on culture, on nation, on language, and so forth. America is an idea. As an idea, is an open-ended idea. I want to remind you that in the book, in the why not moderation, the last chapter is called "The Last Beacon of Hope," and it's a conversation that I imagined precisely with two radicals, left and
Yes.
right, who do not think that America has lived up to its idea. And
Lauren on the left and Rob on the right. Right.
exactly,
Right.
Lauren from L and Rob from right.
Right.
And we start from a quote that I like very much from Jacques Turgot, who was
Mm.
a famous statesman economist in 18th century France. And this is what he wrote: the Americans are the hope of the world, 1780s. They may become a model to it. The asylum they open to the oppressed of all nations should console the earth. the bar is very high in Turgot's sentence, right? The asylum of the oppressed ones. The irony today is that we closed our borders, we deny the right to enter to people who are really oppressed around the world. Um, Look at what happens to those who helped us in Afghanistan.
Mm.
They had to leave, but they have had hard time resettling in America. Some of them. So this is the idea of America, the asylum for those who are oppressed around the
When
world.
was that quote uttered?
I
When was?
think 1780s,
Oh, in the 1780s. Okay.
1770s, maybe 1780s, but certainly after the independence.
Uh-huh.
And I think that sets the bar very high.
Yeah.
Do we live up to that? No, by no means. Even today, this is kind of a desideratum. It's like a standard that we should be judged against. But we don't. It's an open-ended experiment, and that's something that I think it's important to teach to our students. um, it's not that we should be proud that we are an exception and we are better and bigger than others. And I think that the words that I put into the mouth of my interlocutors in Lawrence and Rob's mouth, I think are a testimony to that. They don't believe that. They don't believe that moderation is possible in America. Look at our cars, look at our bodies, look at our buildings, and so forth, and look at houses. But I think that what's important is to keep this faith in the symbol. The symbol is there to elevate us, to inspire us to do better. And that's why I think that it's impossible to declare the failure of the American project, because it's an experiment, it's an
Mhm.
open experiment. Like all experiments, there are setbacks and there are steps forward. And I think that keeping that awareness alive is essential to us. Now, students can do a lot to learn more about the history, the past, and that's why I think that, for example, even learning and debating a controversial project such as the 1619 project, I think it
Oh,
can be
yes.
helpful, can be very helpful, because it allows us to learn new things maybe, and try to counteract false narratives. And I think that instead of forbidding the teaching of alternative stories, I think we should encourage them, but we shouldn't accept them as dogmas either. And I as a moderate, as a political moderate, I've always resisted any narratives that wants to convey the image of America as, let's say, a nightmare of systematic racism. There is a lot of racism in our country, and there are, various ways of fighting against it. But seeing everything through the lenses of racism, I don't think renders justice to the history of the millions of people who fought for justice and liberty in America.
Yeah, just as a side note, to the point of the 1619 project, and it's relevant to our discussion. Hannah Nicole Jones wrote this, and it was this whole collection of essays and ideas, and even some op-ed artwork. Originally appeared in the New York Times. Now you can buy it as a book. I'm just telling my listeners this. And one of Jones's central claims, which certainly elicited a brilliant counter response from people like Sean Wilentz and Gordon S. Wood and people like that, was that the American Revolution was fought to preserve slavery. Um, it's just not true. There's no evidence to that. They rightly jumped in, but where I'm going with this is to criticize the 1619 project in many circles is inherently racist. That's how preposterous our polarization can be.
It's
You
not.
know,
It's not racist. It's
no,
it's it's an invitation to try to figure out the historical truth. And like with many historical narratives, there are false narratives, and there
yes,
is a kernel of truth in some, and
yep,
some are just not good narratives. And it's interesting that both Sean Wilentz and Gordon Wood, a man of the left and a man of the center right,
yeah,
stood together to criticize that for lack of historical accuracy. But the debate, I think, is essential, and that's why I'm let's say concerned about efforts, for example, like the initiatives taken by Florida Governor Ron DeSantis to
terrible.
kind of go against that narrative by forbidding the teaching of critical race theory and other things. I don't think that is the right answer, and I don't think that would help in the long run sort out the historical truth.
Yeah, I mean, and I think one of the great ironies of and it applies certainly to the right and the left, but I think of the left more in this regard. One of the great ironies in their sort of opposition to moderation is that they're often advocating the dismantling or overthrowing, and I don't mean violently, this system, which that particular system enables them to be able to discourse, and that particular system protects them. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, they're willing to almost um, um, eliminate it in the name of some kind of utopian ideal, but they have nothing in place to replace it other than their ideals.
Well, I see the same temptation on the right,
Yes,
Adam, and
yes,
I think that the criticism leveled at liberal democracy are not accompanied by a realistic program for moving forward.
right,
Um, of course, as we talked earlier, a liberal democracy like the American representative government today, we are not necessarily speaking a democracy, but we live in a representative government. That's
right,
important.
yes,
I think that our system offers us enough guarantees to search in common for the truth and
hmm,
to live with dignity and respect each other. But it's far from being a perfect system, and it would take another podcast to enumerate all of the problems we are facing. But I think that I mentioned earlier, there's a distinction to be made between piecemeal reforms,
yes,
piecemeal, step by step, small ones, and big attempts to revolutionize society from scratch. And I hear voices saying we're too corrupt, we've gone too far, the influence of money in politics is too nefarious. We need a total reshaping of the system. There are people who actually push for a new constitutional convention, and there are people on the other side who like me who say it's also Ben Franklin's position. I'm not sure a new constitutional convention could do any better, and I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure, and I fear it will do much worse, given our level of toxic polarization today. So I think that's the major thing. We can reform, we can do small steps forward, but to revolutionize it, to reshape the whole system, I think it's not a good idea. And I think the dialogue that I imagine between the two radicals and me at the center of the conversation, I think speaks to that. I tell my radical friends, my young radical friends, wait a minute, look at initiatives that have worked, like I like, for example, organizations such as Braver Angels because
right.
they seek to address the issue of polarization in a pragmatic, concrete way at the local level. No big plans for changing society, but making sure that we can move forward together, disagree civilly in a civil manner, and work our problems together.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the authoritarianism, just to use a sort of rubric that exists on the right, and you mentioned January 6th, but that I think has been a real byproduct of Trumpism. It's central to Trumpism. It's become it's not conservative. It's MAGA. It has um, it turned very, very much like, I guess you might say, fascism did, to state power, like DeSantis is using, to eliminate this or ban a book, or quite frankly, in the most superficial sense, own the libs. If the Democrats are for reading To Kill a Mockingbird, well, we should ban it. I mean, it's a very almost anti-intellectual way of thinking, but it's interesting how the party of limited government, supposedly, ostensibly, uh, it now believes in this kind of large colossus. Even at the state level, it still wants to use state power to what they say is rectifying the wrongs. I say is retarding the progress. But it's an interesting um, outgrowth of Trumpism because Trump is so dangerous, but the spawning of other people who might be performance artists for all we know, they're tapping into that and making that fundamental to the party's core. And I think that is, as I don't need to put an emphasis on how dangerous that is.
And that they may take it to a higher level. So that's the fear among some of my friends, that DeSantis would be more effective in doing that
Yes.
than Trump. But on this issue, I've been surprised by the attraction that many of my friends on the right have felt for Viktor Orban, the Prime
Right.
Minister of Hungary, who has done precisely that, using the levers of state power, to create a clientelistic system that has basically eviscerated the opposition in Hungary,
Hmm.
given positions of economic privilege to its acolytes, and basically changed the constitution to suit its taste and short-term interests. I mean, changing the judiciary is bad enough. We see this temptation in Israel
Right now.
right
Yeah.
now,
Yep.
but it has worked in Hungary and to some extent in Poland. But in Hungary, Orban has managed to change the constitution. It's basically impossible to dislocate his party from power, and that's a temptation that I think is attractive to some who are propagating that idea that the deep state, needs to be reformed and used for their purposes, not for other purposes. But I think at the end of the day, this is something that will pass. But it's something that concerns me deeply, and it's something that we should take very seriously.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I lament all the time, because I'm politically homeless, I'm a registered independent. I was raised a Democrat, but the left wing of the Democratic Party, and I don't believe the Democratic Party is monolithic. I think it actually is made up of quite a few different types of thinking, where I think the Republican Party is more monolithic, not entirely in its ideology. I've definitely I'm always sorry, I guess, that there isn't a viable center right or Tory party or something that would again propagate humility and virtue, right? That would ask questions in a moderate fashion. For example, we need an infrastructure bill, or we need a semiconductor bill, or whatever that is. We're not going to automatically deploy the federal government to pass that law. We're actually going to sit down like thinkers and say, can the market do any of this? Not that the market's infallible, but is there another way not to spend another 2 or 3 trillion? Can we ask that question without saying, oh, we're throwing kids into the street and you don't want to feed people and you're a monster? It's like, okay, well, as soon as we go to that place, the discussion's over and we're back
Yeah, polarized.
into our polarization. I mean, but what I mean is the Democratic. Why I'm saying this is the Democratic Party, and not yet, but this is my pessimistic prediction. The post-Biden Democratic Party will be in resistance to Orbanism, Viktor Orbanism, Trumpism, DeSantisism, and I think start to go down a very bad road as well. I don't exactly know what form it'll take, but the absence of this middle ground in our two-party system, which I think is so decrepit, is to me very ominous.
Well, there's good news and bad news. If we look at history again,
Yeah. Yes.
you'll remember Arthur Schlesinger wrote an
Sure.
important book in 1949 called The Vital
The
Center.
vital center. Sure. Yeah.
It was a vital center made possible by the fight against communism. So there was kind of a clear enemy there that everyone agreed upon, or most everyone agreed upon. Now that is gone for the time being. China might emerge as that common. I've seen some bipartisan measures being taken and legislation being passed that seeks to counter the economic offensive of China and political offensive. But I don't know. But that vital center has diminished over time to the point that today I think that to be effective, moderates need to work at different levels. Now, it has been said, and this was Charles Whelan who said that about 10 years ago in his book on the center, that the strategy could be on cultivating moderates in the Senate. And indeed, if you look at that, you don't need a party of moderates in the Senate. You need a few moderate figures on both sides that would be kind of trimmers
Mhm.
that would would sometimes vote for one in one
And
direction, or
America always had it. We had
and
conservative
America always had
Democrats
it.
and liberal Republicans. It was
Right,
actually a regional split more than an
right.
ideological split. But anyway,
Exactly. New
yes,
England with the liberal
yes,
conservatives, and the South for conservative Democrats. But the issue that issue is somewhat history now, unfortunately. And the question is, how can we reform our political system to allow these moderates to survive? Ben Sass has resigned from the Senate to become president of University of Florida. I'm curious to see how his relationship will pan out with Ron DeSantis as governor of Florida. But there are other moderates who left. There are very few moderates who were able to win elections, re-election. I think Lisa Murkowski is an exception here, and Sue Collins maybe. But bottom line is that it doesn't take a lot. Listening to you, I was reminded that there are some parties in other countries that call themselves moderates. I don't know whether you've heard of this. There's a moderate party in Sweden. It's
no,
called Moderaterna. If you Google it, you'll find it. It's a historical party that started, I think, in 1902 or 1904. So it's a 100 years old and plus, and it's a party that has given the country a few prime ministers. It's the third largest party right now. It used to be somewhat classical liberal. It veered towards more conservative anti-immigration. Tinkered a little bit with some extreme fringes on the right, but it's still, I think, getting now over 10% or so of the vote. It's called Moderaterna. It's an interesting example to look at. Of course, it's Sweden. It's another political culture, another political system, but it exists, something like that. So it's not entirely impossible to have a moderate party. But I don't think that we need to look for a moderate party.
no,
We need to look to cultivate habits of moderation
correct.
within the system that we have. Now, America has always been inhospitable to a third party.
Hmm.
So the political system in America is designed post past post, first past post.
There's past
Uh,
post, yeah,
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 no proportional representation has kind of allowed the creation of these two parties. And when we had three parties, it didn't work that
no.
well, and it still doesn't work. But you know, should we have a Whig party in America? A Whig party we haven't had since 1854. The
Right.
Whigs were you know
Royal through about slavery, and they couldn't get it
yeah, they
together.
couldn't get
Yeah,
together. But
right.
the issue of slavery, while it ended the party was instrumental for 3 decades between 1820s and 1850s
Yeah,
in allowing the country to grow economically to sustain the blow of a civil war that was fought over the issue of slavery. So it had its own role, and it gave the country big statesmen from Daniel Webster to Abraham Lincoln,
yeah.
who became a Republican after that. Yeah.
Right, right. Given that you're a professor and this is your area of expertise, I need to ask you because you're in it now. I was only actually went to graduate school in my early 40s, so I had a flavor for the sort of contemporary climate. How are your students responding? Because your book is a letter to young radicals, but how are your students on the whole responding to moderation and its tradition?
Well, if I taught, let's say, at Princeton or at Brown, where I studied at Princeton, you at Brown, I would say that I would probably have more radical students. My
Hmm.
students at Bloomington in Indiana
Yeah,
come from different backgrounds, and I would say they are more inclined to receive my message with, let's say, greater enthusiasm than if I taught elsewhere. I think that there's something in the culture of the Midwest that makes people and students in particular more open to these views. As I was mentioning, I was just teaching the essay by Bret Stephens, The Art of Civil Disagreement, and I asked the students what they thought about some of the points that Stephens made. Stephens is a center right. He worked for Wall Street Journal before
yes,
moving to New York Times, and they liked the piece. They agreed with the points that Stephens makes in his article. So they didn't feel offended by what he says there, and I see this as a good sign. Now, cultivating this let's say propensity to disagree well and to put yourself into the minds of those who disagree with you, so that you can see the world through their own eyes rather than through your own eyes, is a difficult task. and it's a difficult bar. It's a high bar to achieve, and I can't ask my students to do it. But overall, I think they feel, to answer your question, that we've reached a point of toxic polarization, and we need to do something about it. We cannot continue down this path. So, you know, whether my students are representative of the whole campus, I can't tell you. They come to my classes, and I have a certain reputation, maybe, for teaching certain courses rather than others. So I'm not sure how representative is of the whole campus, let alone the country at large. But it seems to me that the students that I teach are open to these arguments that we can do better, that we need to relearn the art of disagreement, and we need to be more acceptance of pluralism of ideas. We talk a lot about diversity. I want to make this point, and I think this would
Yes.
interest our listeners. Um, the word diversity has become a catchphrase
Yes.
on campus. We have
Yes.
diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives that are actually good ideas, but they don't take diversity always seriously. And I want
Oh,
to emphasize this point.
okay.
We talk about diversity of gender, race, and backgrounds, social backgrounds. Those are important. I want to emphasize the importance of diversity of viewpoints. Diversity of viewpoints is the lifeblood of democracy. If
Mm.
we all think the same, if we all comfort in our positions, that we will end up in a semi-totalitarian or authoritarian state. And I think that I'm all for diversity, but we need to go full spade. We need to make sure that our commitment to diversity is not just a sham, but we take it seriously. So I want strong debates. I want to see different viewpoints. I just dislike monologues, people agreeing with each other, and I think that is a temptation today on American campuses to speak about diversity but not take it seriously.
Yes, I mean, because that was actually the next question. It's a perfect segue. This, what I fear, what I worry about, and this certainly is older than my time at graduate school, and well outside the academy. It's corporate America, everywhere else, and in life, is the identity politics idea, which I think is not insignificant. Meaning, this idea that we're all balkanized by race or ethnicity. Not only is it contra to the American ideal, as we were talking about, of
Melting pot, yeah.
a melting pot, but it makes the wrong kind of diversity. It really does. Central to the idea of moderation and growth and humility. Not
Well,
that we shouldn't be diverse. I don't want to misstate for listeners. What I mean, though, to your point, is if you don't allow, if you only have ethnic diversity, but you don't have intellectual diversity, you really don't have diversity.
and that's exactly my point. I
Right.
mean, you cannot ignore ethnic diversity or racial diversity. Those
Right.
are essential to living in a
Yes.
democratic society.
Yes.
But intellectual diversity should also be cultivated, should be encouraged, should be promoted, and I don't see that being the case today. It's actually less so. So the paradox is that the more we talk about diversity in one area, the less of it we have in another one. And I don't think that true diversity in one can subsist with true diversity in another area. So I'm reluctant to push this point too far, because there are initiatives on campus to create chairs in conservative thought, for example.
Oh, okay.
Uh, I've known one, for example, at the University of Colorado at Boulder, at the Benson Center, um, and I'm of two minds on that. On the one hand, it's important to bring people who give lectures and represent different perspectives, but to have just one, I kind of resist this idea of you having a pure conservative chair or a pure liberal chair in something. I i think that you can find people who can argue on both sides, and they don't have to have this purity test. So this brings me to the issue that is linked to this. There's a tendency today to apply, and this is a part of the book that I hold to be very important to my worldview here, to use litmus tests and purity tests. So, in other words, we are now increasingly judged based on this litmus test. If you are a little bit impure, which means eclectic, which means wishy-washy, maybe sometimes you lean to the left, sometimes you lean to the right, you are declared impure, unreliable, and
Right.
as a result, you are dismissed
Right.
because you are not one of our tribes.
Right.
This is a manifestation of what we call tribalism,
Yes.
sectarianism. You are not of my sect. I cannot rely on you because sometimes you lean to the left, sometimes on the right. Therefore, you are excluded. That is a temptation that moderates like me, I dare say, fight against because it's not good for our democracy. Litmus test, purity test, not good. And if you look at the recent discourse, people on the right, for example, in the aftermath of January 6th, 2021, have gone after those on the right who have been critical of Trump and others because they have not stood with their tribe. They've um,
Liz Cheney, is out of the
yeah,
tribe.
Liz Cheney is and the other representative
Adam
from Michigan,
Kinzinger.
Adam
Yeah.
Kinzinger. So
From
they've
Illinois. Yeah.
been
Yeah.
yeah, and the other ones who voted against, they've been excommunicated from the tribe because they
Yeah.
are impure. The irony is that they elected Elise Stefanik, who voted less on conservative issues
Right.
than Liz Cheney, but
Right.
she's pure, whereas Liz Cheney is impure. So that temptation is very dangerous. It can be found also on the left, and I think that. The attacks on Senator Manchin or Cinema, I think, are representative of this tendency, and I think that we need to speak up against that, and we need to say this is not good. Democracy doesn't rely on litmus tests, purity tests. Uh, I dislike profoundly the um, that criterion. How do you vote on abortion? How do you vote on guns? And therefore, you get the
Yes.
number, and then for you are eligible or not. I don't think that that's democratic.
Yeah. One of the last things I want to say before we go, but I have another question after that. It, for many, many years as a political observer, which I am and have been long before my podcast, in the age of Obama, especially, I voted for Obama twice. But the rhetoric that was coming in support of him, and again, this is obviously more on the left or even the center left, was, and going back, to the 80s and whatever, is that, you know, every Republican's a devil, and so we can't have them. Obama, John McCain was it. People don't remember John McCain was a devil. Mitt Romney was a devil. And where I'm going with this is when the real devil came to call, named Donald John Trump, it was too late because you
Not
can't
too
call
late.
it because by if you think in my mind, in my line of thinking, which is always evolving, of course, by eschewing a moderate idea, by resisting the notion of patience and virtue and clear thinking, you pave the way unwittingly for that which you fear.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this tendency to manichaeism, black and white,
Black and white. Yeah.
forces of light, forces of darkness, um, doesn't render justice to the complexity of the political scene. There are many nuances. The Polish dissident Adam Michnik, about whom I wrote in my
Yes.
other book, Faces of Moderation, he once said that gray too can be beautiful. He has an essay with this title, Gray too can be beautiful. There are nuances of gray. It's not all black and white. And you know, it's I think political judgment requires that we make choices and we work with nuances. And I think that nuances are the most difficult. Most people who think ideologically work with contrasts, and
Hmm.
contrasts are clear cut and unambiguous. Nuances are ambiguous, more difficult to detect with the natural eye, and require some fine tuning. And I think that's something that some of us miss, or most of us miss most of the time.
Right. Um, Aurelian, given that you've written a lot of great books, but in this new book that's coming out, and I think when the book comes out, I want to have further conversation with you again, because you're in a moderate home. This is a sanctuary, so to speak, for you. What would, if you had to say two things that you want this book to do in terms of how it would impact the general culture, what would that be? In a more utilitarian sense, if that makes sense.
So the title would convey my first message. The title is "Why Not Moderation." So I think that I would like for us to really give moderation a chance in the sense that we should take it seriously rather than dismiss it as a virtue that is weak, undemocratic, or simply ineffective. That would be the first message. But the second message is that we cannot afford to cut the branch on which we sit. This is the message that I took from a German economist, Wilhelm Röpke, who in February of 1933 gave a very courageous speech in Frankfurt. This was 8 days after Hitler came to power as chancellor. And in that speech, he was lecturing his fellow compatriots, and he was telling them that we should not be so reckless as to cut off, to saw off the branch on which we sit. And that branch is liberal democracy. So the message that I want to convey is that, okay, we live in an imperfect system. That system has given us a lot of freedoms and opportunities and has yet to be made better. We can make it better, but in order to we don't need to do it, we don't need to discard the legacy, the traditions that we have. We need to work with them and improve them. So that's the message that I want to give to those who are restless, critics maybe, impatient, dreamers. It's good to dream, but let's make sure that we don't jeopardize what we achieve. This legacy of rules, norms, behaviors, institutions, traditions that allow us to live a decent life, and I think that's very precious.
Indeed, folks, that book that Aurelian's talking about is again called "Why." It's not out yet, but it will be, and I'm you probably should be envious that I've already had a look at it, but you will too in August. Why Not Moderation? Letters to Young Radicals. Aurelian Craiutu, professor of political science. It has been a real pleasure, and I'd love to have you be a friend of the program and a wonderful interlocutor for me, certainly, as we go forward with Dirty Moderate. So thank you so much for joining.
I'm grateful for the opportunity, and I want to say that the book is already available for pre-order on both Amazon and the Cambridge University Press site. But the issue is not the book itself as this virtue that is essential to our life together in a democratic society. So it's for the sake of that virtue that a conversation like this is so precious. And thank you for the opportunity.
We, Aurelian, also, we will put the link up for the listeners, just so you know, so that they can pre-order it. But again, thank you very much. And all those listening, stay dirty, stay moderate, and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you. Aurelian, hang on one second, if you would.